Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I have to say it's a pleasure to be here in person after 2 very long years behind a Zoom screen. I'm sure you can all relate to that as well. Today I have the pleasure of kicking off a really exciting panel on deforestation, and I'll be sharing with you some insights from a forthcoming report on the G7's role in international deforestation and some of the things that we can do about it. I first wanted to offer a few reflections and recognise that the world has shifted quite a bit since this issue started to gain prominence in the G7 Environment Communiqué last year. We're facing a mix of interconnected global issues. I'm going to call them the 4 Cs. Bear with me a second. We've got the rising cost of food, the conflict in Ukraine, continued COVID recovery, lots of Cs there, and an ever-warming climate. These immediate challenges, at first glance, seem really good excuses and reasons for delaying action on tropical deforestation. But today, I'm going to tell you why this issue, now more than ever, needs to remain top of the agenda for the G7. If you take just one message from this presentation today, I'd like it to be that the efforts here in this room to achieve more sustainable supply chains is an investment in global food security. So I'm going to tell you a bit now about why tropical forest protection should remain at the top of the agenda. We heard from Gemma and colleagues earlier on the panel that our food system is broken. Tropical forests are depleting at an alarming rate, but we actually need them for our future global food security. And I think the evidence is pretty irrefutable. You might recognise this illustration here from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. It illustrates what they call planetary boundaries, which is the space within which humanity continue to grow and thrive. We see here how current food production is totally broken, it's totally unsustainable, and it's already causing us to cross and pressure several of these boundaries. But what does this mean? What does this mean for us? We know that with climate change, we're going to see disruption to the food system. So this could mean concurrent crop failures becoming increasingly likely. Just last year, we saw food prices soar as droughts were simultaneously recorded across all inhabited continents. The crisis in Ukraine is a tragic insight into what happens when a major food-producing region is no longer able to produce, in this case because of a tragic conflict. But this has exacerbated pre-existing supply chain disruptions and has caused food prices to surge. We've also seen certain market responses such as export bans, production shifts, and strained trade relations. But what we know is that tropical forests are a key ingredient for food system resilience. But they are being cleared at an alarming rate. As we've heard already, a main driver globally for clearance is agriculture. Close to 90% of tropical deforestation has occurred because of agricultural expansion. And some figures hot off the press from Global Forest Watch give us a pretty bleak outlook. In 2021, the tropics lost 3.75 million hectares of primary forest, a rate which is equivalent to roughly 10 football pitches every minute. I'm just going to let you imagine the football pitches there for a minute, but this is an extremely shocking figure. And the underlying drivers for this are economic. We see very low value of standing forest, as well as weaknesses in governance and law enforcement. If you add on top of this demand for commodities from consumer countries and the fact that most consumer markets have no or limited systems to distinguish between sustainable and unsustainable products, you add even further pressure. I now want to explore the G7's role in all of this. So between 2005 and 2017, the G7, including EU member states, were responsible for nearly a third of commodity-driven tropical deforestation associated with international trade. Sorry, that was a very long sentence, so I'll just let that sink in for 1 second. To bring this to life, let's think of it in terms of land masses. In hectares, that's roughly the equivalent to the landmass of Costa Rica, which, as we all know, is well known for its lush tropical forests and rich biodiversity. I'm sure many of you in this room will not be surprised by the key culprit commodities that we see on this side of the slide here. For the same period, China and India were responsible for 17% and 6% respectively during that same period. Now, G7 members have all committed to voluntary targets. For example, the New York Declaration on Forests, which aimed by 2020 to eliminate deforestation from the production of agricultural commodities. Well, 2020 has been and gone, so some lessons there on kind of voluntary initiatives. And the ink is barely dry on the Glasgow Leaders Declaration, where 141 countries came together at COP26, and they called they agreed to halt and reverse forest loss by 2030. What the most recent data tells us is that the rate of primary forest loss has been stubbornly high and consistent over the past few years. And what this tells us, without very concerted efforts, we're not going to meet the Glasgow target. Excuse me. The Glasgow Leaders Declaration and other voluntary commitments that we're seeing G7 members sign up to are just one of the examples of approaches that we're assessing as part of our study. Connie trailed it, but this will be out in June, and it's looking at some of the voluntary and legislative approaches that G7 members are taking to tackle this phenomenon. I think one of the key messages that we can say is that voluntary approaches are just not going far enough, right? They're not going far enough, fast enough to address this problem. So I think what's very clear is that demand-side measures, mandatory measures, are going to be a critical part of the mix. And there's a lot of text on this slide, apologies. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because we don't have the time to do this, but I just want to briefly touch on due diligence approaches because they're obviously gaining a huge amount of attention in the deforestation world, and they're increasing relevance, of course, to the G7, and we're going to hear more, I hope, from Bojan and others on the panel next. But I just want to highlight, I think, an important distinction, which I don't think we've captured so far today. The first one is we see a general corporate obligation of due diligence, which applies to an enterprise's entire operations and supply chains, and it's not specific to a sector or product. And we see examples of that in France and Germany. We've talked about those already today. I think quite distinct to that is a market-related obligation of due diligence, which is where enterprises are required to have conducted due diligence before a product enters a market. I think that's an important distinction to make, and you've of course seen examples of this for the timber sector across many G7 members. All of this is to say that there are a range of policy options, and there's a huge toolbox that can be deployed depending on national circumstances to achieving common goals. And as I said, the paper will be coming out in June, but I wanted to give you a sneak preview of 3 of the key takeaways from that paper. So the first one, I want to come back to the previous panel where do we have our panelists? But we talked about a spaghetti bowl a lot, which I want to return to now. I think the first recommendation is that we should be aiming for policy harmonisation across G7, but not necessarily uniformity. Clearly, we don't want a spaghetti bowl because that doesn't make it easy or predictable for businesses. It doesn't help produce a country context either. But I think it recognises that each country has a different legislative process and timeline. So we can align on policy outcomes, but, maybe make room for different methods and national circumstances. I think the key thing to emphasise here is that there should be legislative coverage that, as a minimum, includes key deforestation risk commodities, and that it should be implemented on an accelerated timeline. I think a second observation I would make here about legislative coverage is that there's huge emphasis on products being traded, but nothing concrete has emerged yet on financial flows linked to deforestation. As some of the largest economies, this is where the G7 could really take a leadership role, and this is a critical gap that should be addressed. The second takeaway I would like to emphasise is that the G7 should be forming genuine partnerships with producer countries. There are limits to how far you can go with demand-side regulation without pairing it with support for enabling environments in tropical forest countries. There's only so far you can go. So I would argue that there should be strong support for producers, and there should be genuine partnership approaches that also recognise that nearly a third of our world's food is produced by smallholder farmers, and that support's required to enable a just rural transition. Finally, the G7 should engage beyond its membership for real scale and impact. You saw on the slide showing the footprint of G7 members. There was a big greyed out area, which is comprises of a number of other countries. But there's real need to quickly step beyond the G7 and engage with other major consumer markets, because we know that projected demographic and dietary shifts mean that those trends are only going in one way. I think there's also a very important engagement to be done with producer countries who are also consumers of a large quantity of deforestation-linked commodities domestically, like Brazil and Indonesia. I don't know if you can see it that clearly, but this graphic includes some of the hotspots if you also take into account deforestation that is embedded in products that are then consumed in certain geographies. And what we see here is the emergence of Brazil and Indonesia in that data as well. I think just to close, I would say that we basically can't carry on the way we're going without risking future food security and resilience. The G7 has a really strong role to play in sending a clear demand signal. This needs to be done using the full policy toolbox, leveraging the G7's leadership position, and in very close partnership with producers. An investment in sustainable supply chains is an investment in future global food security. I look forward to hearing the panel's thoughts on these issues. Thank you very much.